So I have now the very great pleasure of introducing Dr. Mike Ryan of the World Health Organization. So I have no doubt that you're no stranger to any of us, Mike. Mike played his key leadership role in coordinating and advising on our global response to the COVID pandemic. He's been at the forefront of managing acute risks to global health for nearly 25 years. And he also hails from County Sligo, so he's one of us. Good to see you again, Mike, and welcome this morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Very well, thanks. Very well. Mike, there's so many things that you've said, and in particular over the last 2 years, we've been hearing and seeing you more and more on our screens that are relevant and pertinent today. In particular, I think I said this to you, what struck me was that history will judge us on how we responded to the poorest communities in their darkest hour. But I think really relevant to this morning is your statement around how unless we can solve the problem of vaccine inequity, if we can't get that right, how can we get climate justice right? So many people say that COVID is quite different in terms of climate action. It was a significant disease, but the response, whilst hard, it was not straightforward, but it was a vaccine, stay at home, wear masks, a test, and the climate change is too complicated. We can't get the same reaction, and the impacts are too far away. But that's not the case anymore, Mike. I mentioned this morning some of those impacts that we're seeing in the news today. So can you talk to us a little bit about your point on vaccine inequity for a moment, and what have we learned through this global tragedy that we're not through yet? What has it taught us about our road to climate action and justice?
Maybe the journey is slightly similar, but COVID was a fantastic scientific revolution in the sense of bringing scientific knowledge to bear on a really complicated problem. We didn't understand the disease, we didn't understand the virus, we didn't understand how to build countermeasures. And in doing that, it was a great victory, but that was not enough. The knowledge and the knowing wasn't enough, and it still isn't enough to stop the virus, because it's the application of that knowledge that is the real answer. So having knowledge, having science is fantastic. It's a necessary prerequisite for success in any human endeavor. But being unable to apply that, or that knowledge not being accepted, is a major obstacle, or how that knowledge is shared in an equitable fashion. And I think I've heard people talk about climate change and say that many communities in developing countries are the ones being affected first and worst in the climate crisis. We've seen that in COVID too. But we've also seen, for me, the worst phenomenon, last and least. So these communities are affected first and worst, but they're the communities that receive help last and they receive the least help. So we have to look at that end of things. And in one ways, we should be all very proud of what was achieved, and especially the Irish community. I think community resilience in Ireland, community participation, the ways in which people sought knowledge, the activation of community solidarity, all of those things were wonderful to behold. I was very proud to be Irish witnessing that. Now, there were tensions and there were difficulties and there was distrust, but I think Ireland reacted extremely well, and many other countries did. But when we had these fantastic new innovations, we were not able to share them to those who needed them most. When we talked about frontline health workers, we talked about vulnerable people all around the world. We knew who was dying, we knew why, we knew the ones that were most likely to die. Yet, 2 years into the crisis, we still have not fixed that. And imagine right now the impact that COVID has had. 2 years of a crisis that in reality kills a small percentage of the people it affects. And look what it's done to the global economy. Look what it's done to politics. Look what it's done to economics. Look what it's done to our societies, the disruption. Now we face into maybe 50 years or 100 years of climate crisis and instability. Are we going to be able to withstand that slower onset, but deep emergency that's going to be created by climate change, and is being created right in front of our faces right now? So no, the experience was both heartening and was uplifting, and on the other hand, deeply tragic and deeply disturbing. And it's very hard for me at this point, before we even end the pandemic, to resolve those two emotions.
Yeah, and interesting, Mike. How do you think we overcome that feeling of doing it for the common good. Have you seen any examples where we've succeeded in that? Because that essentially is the answer to climate. If we could really get people to think about this small blue planet as one global community, have you seen any really good results from our evidence of that?
Well, not just in COVID, but in many other interventions I've done and been part of over the years. I think we get things wrong in a sense. I use an analogy of only a number of months ago, watching a documentary about the building of the Golden Gate Bridge in California. And I had never realized you have to build a suspension bridge from both sides. You can't actually build it from one side to the other. And I think a lot of our mental model of development and of science and of research and application is develop it globally, and then it trickles down into communities. And therefore, the scientists know best, the experts know best, governments know best. And unless and until that is turned around and you build from the community back up, you can generate the knowledge at global level. But unless that knowledge is integrated into people's daily lives, unless people see and understand and participate in the process of making those decisions, it will always be external. And that's why COVID generated a lot of solidarity at local level. People saw the local effects. People didn't set up food banks and visit people in long-term care facilities because they saw it on the television. They did it because their mother, their father, their friend, their neighbor was sick. They saw the direct impact, they saw the impact on their lives, and they saw that they could do something about it. They could protect themselves, they could protect others, they could bring meals to doctors and nurses working in hospitals, they could visit the elderly. They could take action, they had agency. They had ownership of part of the solution. And I think sometimes we in the scientific community, and it's not a bad thing, or it doesn't make us bad people, but it means that we have an arrogant interpretation of the wonderfulness of our knowledge, and how we can't understand why people just don't accept that. They can't understand why people just don't see the logic. And we get frustrated, and then we become even more directive, and we raise our voices louder, and we increase the level of alarm, right? And that shuts people down even more. So we end up creating a very dysfunctional dialogue. It's not even a dialogue, it becomes a monologue, and it becomes a shouting match. And I think we do a lot of research, and that research is very important. But again, we tend to focus on technological research, scientific research, research on drugs, research on, and you see the same in climate. The thing we really struggled in was understanding human reaction to a crisis, understanding how humans process knowledge and information about threat, about risk, about vulnerability, and how they absorb, who they listen to, where they listen to, who influences, how they process knowledge, and then how do they take action on that knowledge. Because if you give someone a catastrophic scenario, most people go to the pub because they think, well, there's nothing I can do about that, right? You know, and I think, you know, the more we in science and research continue to just raise alarms, cry wolf all the time, we just generate anxiety. We don't generate action. And the problem is we're an anxiety generating machine now, not an action generating machine. And we need to look at how we can switch that around. I mean, that's my experience in epidemics. It may not be exactly the same in climate, but that's my personal experience. And that's with communities all over the world.
Can I draw you back then to the Irish experience? You touched on it a minute ago, and you know, so many of us working close to a crisis like you're doing, or many of us working on the energy transition or in climate action, we get frustrated. Like you said, we start banging a drum because it's like, look, the evidence is so clear. Why aren't we getting change in behaviors? But we did see a glimmer of hope in Ireland in the response to COVID. We had one of the most successful uptakes of the vaccine globally, and we generally did behave cohesively as a society. What, from your inside and outside view, because you were looking at it from the eagle view, but also being an Irish person looking at it, what do you think we got right, and what can we learn from that to try and apply it to climate?
Well, I think there's still, I mean, it's something I remark on all the time. Irish people like to talk, but they also like to listen. You'll see the survival of things like radio in Ireland, or it's an amazing phenomenon. I was home on holidays. I don't listen to radio here in Switzerland, but if you go home to Ireland, you spend half your day with one ear on a radio listening to some talk show. So we do, I think, as an increasingly multi-ethnic society, we're good at generating discussion and dialogue. And I do think that's part of the success. I think the other part is that there's still a deep trust and respect in Ireland for people, doctors, for nurses, for scientists. There is that sense, you know, that people still respect knowledge. There's a great respect for the storyteller, for the performer, for anyone who can entertain, anyone who can provide input to communities has always been celebrated in Ireland. That idea of being welcome with knowledge, being welcome with any form of performance, entertainment, it doesn't matter. We you know, it's incredible how, you know, in Ireland, things like poetry, things like that are still very proud. People still, you know, many of my friends will send me poems, you know, and I think, like, you know, it's so I do think there's that something about Irish society. We're lucky to still have that. We may be losing it, but there is that still that willingness, and there is still trust. And even though we complain about the government and we complain about politicians, and we're constantly doing that in every society, I still think people in Ireland feel connected to their representatives. They often know their representatives. They often know someone who knows that person. They're connected in some way, whether they're one side of the political divide or the other. So there's still a sense in Ireland that people can affect the debate, that you can walk up to your local politician and say something. So I do think there's a sense of, there's still people, Irish people still have that sense of agency, that sense of ability to act. And I do think that was part of that response. I also think a lot of excellent communicators in Ireland were out there talking all the time. There was transparency. And I think that's very, very important, that you have that transparency from government, transparency from leaders, that you admit when things are bad, you admit when things are wrong. You do not try to cover over, to gloss over, or to create and massage facts. That's a very dangerous thing to do, because that becomes marketing. And it's a very, very big difference, in my view, between communications and marketing. And it's really important that we understand that as we communicate with people, because this is not a once-off communication on climate. And we knew that in COVID. This wasn't going to be one ad campaign and it's all over. This is going to be a process of long-term communication. And it takes weeks, months, and years and decades to build trust, to build that listenership, to build people who trust your voice. And it takes minutes to lose it if you betray that trust. And trust is at the center of this. Who do I trust? Who do I listen to? You know?
Yeah, and I'm going to actually touch on the transparency piece in a minute. But interesting when you say about how you had to keep that trust up through COVID. What did you do at the World Health Organization? Because I know at home here, we had obviously the regular news briefings, and we were very aware in the background that kind of messaging was being tested, and conversations were being had with even representative groups of communities. So what was used in the World Health Organization to keep that, like you said, it's communications, it's two-way dialogue, it's listening as much as speaking, really, isn't it? I think I lost your mic there. Yeah.
No, I'm there. I think WHO is as deeply flawed an organization as any. We're all human beings, and we went on a major learning journey as well during this response. We had to scale up to levels that we've never had to do before. We had to deal with a crisis in 194 countries at one time. Normally our crises are Pakistan, there's a flood, or in Ukraine, there's a war. We know what we need to do in a certain geographic area. It can be overwhelming, but it has geographic limits, and you have a specific idea. We were trying to communicate with multiple cultures through multiple languages in a 24-hour news cycle, where people's perceptions in different countries of infectious disease, their trust in their own governments, the activity of the media and how it's controlled or not controlled was different in every single setting. So our messaging had to work across all of that. So it was a huge challenge to be able to do that credibly, to be able to do that authentically, and to maintain trust and continue communicating the whole time. The one thing we did learn in that, though, and we had been doing it before, but we had never applied it at this level, was not just communicating with governments, but for WHO, communicating directly with populations, but also communicating with groups in civil society. We had a world of work in which we had hundreds of thousands of people around the world working in unions, working in both in employer organizations, in union organizations, talking about work. We had a world of faith in which we had all the major faiths in the world and leaders in those faiths coming on webinars. We were doing webinars with youth organizations, with representation groups for older people, all kinds of different groups.
So a really joint up approach in terms
and just trying to keep the dialogue going, not worrying too much about preparing everything, not worrying about the perfect conference and the perfect pitch and the perfect presentation, but making ourselves available all the time to talk to anybody who wanted to talk about this. It's really hard to do. It's really hard to sustain. And it's really hard to fund, because when you go to the bosses and the donors and say, look, we want to have this massive dialogue with everybody. We want to keep talking to everyone. They say, well, what about the research? Where's the vaccine coming from? So you'll get the money for the vaccine, you get the money for the therapeutics, you get the funding for all of the technology, because, or for, I call it the yellow ribbon syndrome. You get money for the things that you can cut the yellow ribbon from, open a new institute, you know, build infrastructure.
The social license to operate, or the behaviors and adoption.
And we did the same. We opened new wings on hospitals, and we built field hospitals, and we put up tents, and we did all that. And that was fantastic because it was visible. But it's the invisible stuff. It's supporting the workforce in the front line, and not just supporting them with protective gear, but giving them psychological support for the work they're doing. And recognizing the impact that the epidemic was having, not only on people's health, physical health, but on people's mental health. And the isolation that people were feeling, and dealing with that, also dealing with things now like we're dealing with post-COVID condition, and recognizing that we have literally millions of people around the world struggling with the long-term effects of COVID. It's very easy to keep focusing on preventing COVID, but there's another group of individuals in the world who are really suffering. And it's very easy in a crisis and with the media cycle to get focused on one or two things. And everyone says, well, that's what the media and the world is interested in. We should focus on that. It's very hard then to step away and focus on the stuff that's not sexy, that's not in the news. And I think that's, for me, that's the learning I think that we did. We did a lot of social listening as well. We used artificial intelligence to look at social media feeds all over the world to see how communities were reacting to restrictions. How were they reacting to what was being talked about? Not what we thought people were reacting, or how we saw uptake of masks or purchases of masks, but actually looking at what people were talking about in social media. You know?
It was very personal too, wasn't it? I know I have a network of a group of 30 international people. We share a WhatsApp group, and we're normally talking about work-oriented things, which are quite climate-focused. Instead, we were talking about personal impact and who had been affected, our families, what was going on down the roads, and it was just a whole different approach, really, wasn't it?
Before we also saw too, just one last point on this, we saw governments, however flawed in their responses, having an open and transparent approach, and over time that has worked. We also saw governments who really hurt their own response by leveraging, manipulating, being part of misinformation and the misinformation cycle. We talked about misinformation and disinformation. You know, there's a lot of, we can all misinterpret what's going on, and we can all have genuine doubts. I say this with anti-vaccination. Many people have genuine concerns and reasonable questions about vaccination. Who wants to put anything into your body without understanding what it does, what its side effects are, what its positive consequences are, what its negative consequences are? So doubt is not a disease. And it's the same on climate change. And we have to address people's doubts. And the idea that people, they're not anti, those people need to be engaged with. And the problem we have in much of our scientific communication is we lump people into the fors and the againsts. We have to work with the people who are against. Because the vast majority of people who are against don't have the right knowledge, don't fully understand, they need more information, they need better engagement, we need to get better. And then at the very edge of that, there's a very small group of individuals who actively manipulate, generate, and disseminate misinformation. And that's a different type of engagement we need with them. And the problem was that it wasn't only people in civil society engaging in those negative behaviors, that was happening too at state level.